Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer 1745 here with my continuing playthrough of Hearts of Iron 4 with the Road to 56 mod. We're still investigating how it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. And of course, you can like this video. It really helps the channel out, and I do appreciate it. So we'll continue this. We are not yet at war with France. Don't know. I figure it has to be something with the mod, including France, I believe, is at... Oh. Oh, good. Now I understand why we're not at war with France. They're at war with the United States. And Britain is at war with the United States. Oh, good, people. This mod is just great. Yeah. Now, I remember a couple of episodes ago, it was actually last weekend when I made them, I was going on about what would happen in the Monroe Doctrine. We did talk about it more recently a little bit too. Had somebody like Mexico declared, or not Mexico, France declared war on El Salvador, because of the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. would intervene in it. That's what really makes all this. Yeah, this is just, well, democratic nations, or substantially democratic nations, have gone to war with each other. We can look at the War of 1812. Britain, yes, is a monarchy in, starting in, well, obviously forever, still is, but well before, when America's fighting for its independence, it is really the policies of Parliament that push America to war. Now, the king was signing the laws that Parliament was passing, and often the king was very supportive of Parliament, but it was Parliament's laws. It wasn't just some king sending over some royal governor that Parliament didn't have anything to do that pissed the American people off. It was parliamentary action. And so then later we also get the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States, that are substantially, both are very democratic institutions, because we can talk about, very much so still in 1800, 1812, whatever, rotten boroughs, the idea, oh, there's 30 people in this, borough that elects a member to Parliament, 13 landholders, say, in an area that elects a member to Parliament, and the other 20,000 people in the area don't vote. There are those types of things, but those are getting more and more rare as various reforms are going through. Now, of course, in the United States, in 1812, obviously, slaves aren't voting, women aren't voting. In some regions, you had to be a landholder to vote. So, within the United States. And obviously, also, you don't vote if you don't live in a state. If you just live in the territory. It's like, still to this day, if you live in Puerto Rico, over here, you vote for, and there's right now riots, now there's demonstrations going on in Puerto Rico, and they vote for their local governor, but they don't vote in the U.S. presidential election, and the people of Guam don't vote in the U.S. presidential election. And the people of Washington, D.C., and it's because they're black. No, it has nothing to do with their skin color. People that live in Washington, D.C. don't vote for a congressman or in the U.S. presidential elections. They do vote for their own mayor, so they have local democracy, but Washington, D.C. is a federal district administered by them, by the federal government. Now, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., and I believe Guam all have a representative to observe, I'm doing air quotes here, you're not seeing it, observe Congress. So meaning basically they elect somebody who has no power, but they can go and speak on Puerto Rican affairs, but they don't vote for, for any laws or anything. So they do send a person sort of a representative to observe Congress, but they're not members of Congress, because membership voting, you need to be a person living in a state. So if you are a U.S. citizen but don't live in a state, and so at this time in 1940, Hawaii and Alaska are not states. There are only 48, so they don't vote in any elections. So, and over time, if you go back far enough, you also have the sort of situation with Indians, and it varied from area to area. And it's more, not so much are you an Indian or not, it's are you living on a reservation? By this time, are you living on a reservation? Or, because there are lots of Indians or Native Americans or whatever you want to call them on the eastern seaboard that have no physical reservation, but they are tribes that are recognized, but they don't have, this land is, the Sioux reservation or something. They didn't have any of that here, but large. And of course they voted in it. So it's not a racial thing. It's a thing. Are you a reservation person, or you are, and this is not today, this is back sort of then, and I don't know exactly when it was all changed, back sort of then, because again, that was sort of, you're again not living in a state, that your reservation may be within the boundaries of the state, but your reservation is not affected by state laws, and which is still to this day. So if Texas passes a law, and then and I know there's Indian reservations within Texas, also a lot of them in Oklahoma too, state laws don't affect things going on the reservation. So what's everybody saying? Wait, is America actually losing? No, America, well, they've lost a teeny bit of territory there, but I don't think they're actually losing. Yeah, Wisconsin is known as the cheeseheads, though. I'm sure there's cheese made in many areas. Yeah, so yeah, just sort of, again, it's, we can talk reservations, and we can look at different time periods with different presidents. The whole of modern day Oklahoma was set up to be an Indian territory, and that's where we get the Trail of Tears under Andrew Jackson, when he sends, because they want to dispossess Indians of even more land, so they force them off of, I think mostly in this part of the southern U.S., and they migrate out to Oklahoma. And this is set up as, the great majority of it is set up as, literally like 80-90% of it, as Indian reservations, that they're sort of self-governing regions, territories within it. And of course, a lot of the Indians die on the way, but I think more make it than die, but it's a harsh thing. That's why you get a lot of eastern seaboard Indians setting up here. So there is a racial component to it, but really it's, with a lot of the, because again, some limited experience of it, a lot of sort of the western tribes, they wanted to continue being Indians and not become, we'll use the less prejudicial term, Anglified, meaning they wanted to live culturally and in the style of the Indians, which are different than our, living in a more Western style or manner, or we can say civilized style manner. So that's why they're set up on reservations in which they can do it. Now, of course, reservations get smaller. Reservations sometimes are almost as literally as large as some of these states. They're, easily some of the reservations at the time were set up as large as modern day Switzerland. So they weren't small areas, but then they would find gold on the reservation and lose territory, kind of things like that, because people wanted the gold. And it's more, I would say, my evaluation of it, it's more of a situation of national conflicts than anything else, because if you had found, I don't know, a bunch of Russians, somewhere around here is the Russian River, still called that today, because there was a Russian colony here, and they were pushing south Spain was pushing north, where the border was in dispute between Russians, and literally in California, somewhere around here, Russia sets up a colonial expedition, meaning they come in and build homes, and Russians move in here, and then they find gold, and so they want to throw the Spanish out. And I'm not talking Indians. I'm talking because the Indians all stay. They want to throw the Spanish out. And the Mexicans, the local Mexicans, are all like, yeah, we living up here don't like the people living, because by this time it's Mexico, but they're sort of more Spanish than Indian down here. We don't want to be ruled by these people down here because they're a bunch of corrupt people. And yeah, all these Anglos coming in are actually pretty nice and not so corrupt because they know about the United States, so they want to join. So we throw out the Russians, we throw out the sort of the Spanish Mexicans, if you will, and the local Mexicans are, again, like we talked in an earlier episode about how Panama is the Panamanians, as they broke away from Colombia, we're very happy. I mean, to like a 90% plus, yeah, happy to be away from Colombia. Again, it was 90% plus of the local Mexicans were like, yeah, joining the United States, that sounds wonderful. Now, no one asked the local Indians, and I don't know if the local Indians had an opinion whether to be ruled by Mexico or ruled by the U.S., whether they thought one was better than the other. If you ask them today, because I've known some from several of the tribes, oh yeah, no, they love being part of the U.S. over being part of Mexico, because Mexico is much or more about Indian extermination than the U.S. was. So not that they don't have hard feelings about European settlement, because again, I've known some of the Native American people that very much involved with their tribes in the past. So not that they don't have hard feelings over European colonization, but if it's between Mexican / Spanish European colonization or Anglo colonization, no, they love the Anglo. If it's between those two, and I talked to several different, in different years. I got a good friend of mine was about half Indian, but very much involved with the stuff. And a lot of the Californian Indians are mixed blood nowadays. But he and talked to some of the other people. Oh yeah, no, they a lot of them have hard feelings about being colonized. But if you're going to pick colonize, who to get colonized by, yeah, no, of the available choices, they definitely like who ended up doing it. They might pick the British and the experience that the British did with Canada a bit more, but compared to the Mexicans, or the French briefly sort of owned some of this territory. Oh no, they like the American colonization experience. Well, never talked to a Native American in real life. Interesting. Yeah, Native American history, that's right. So there's still Russians in California from the colonial days, like their descendants or something. Probably a few, but it was a really small expedition. Now, this is at a time when Alaska was still owned by the Russian Empire. This area was somewhat, not really well settled, even whether Britain was claiming it or the U.S. is claiming, or because the U.S. was sort of claiming a bit further north up here at some point, because it's sort of the Louisiana Purchase is sort of like where all these rivers drain, because it actually specifies where the territory between Spain at the time, because it was before Mexican independence, and where Spanish territory and where the territory that the French out of Louisiana was, it's sort of rivers, headlands, continental divide, where the watersheds go to one side or the other. So some of this territory would have been considered, and you can see some of the maps, it sort of goes up to some of these rivers, would have been sort of considered as part of the Louisiana Purchase. But eventually, whatever this, because the U.S. wanted 54-40 or fight. I remember that slogan. And that's a little further north. They didn't fight Britain. That would have been the Third War, Independence, 1812. There was possibly for a third war, pushing for a bit northern of the border, but eventually they settle on this basic parallel here for everything, you know, out far west where there's, at the time, there was basically nobody. Here we can follow some rivers and obviously the lakes. But yeah, so this was all sort of Americans, Russians, and British starting to come in up here, and it was the fur trade was a lot of what was doing, and a lot of that fur trade was trading over here with China. So that was, and some of it was going back to Europe as well too, most assuredly. But the Russians were pushing down into California and had a few other very small settlements. And so, yeah, I don't think the Native Americans would have liked the Russian colonial experience had it been more significant over time. Russians, I forget their names, but they're sort of a indigenous peoples up here that very loosely, very, very loosely I'm talking, are sort of like Native Americans in their sort of tribal atmosphere, in their low-tech environment that the Russians for many, many years battled up in this region. They're different than the Asians of China or Mongolia. They're a different genetic group. I don't know in details, but they're sort of maybe a bit more aligned to what we would think of Eskimos. I don't know in detail, so you can go look up whatever. But I remember reading about the time of muzzle loading rifles, not muskets, but rifles and whatnot, that they're battling up in here, and the Russians aren't treating them very nicely at all. There's no real in any of these places continuous Russian cultural groups. They've all long since, if any of them, and I'm sure some stayed. I'm absolutely sure some stayed, and presumably their descendants. They've long since enculturated into the American culture. They don't speak Russian. They don't have any real sense of community amongst themselves. They're just, and they were in small numbers even up in Alaska, but there are no like Russian restaurants or anything, to my knowledge, that remain of the colonial experience up there. And that was just sort of a bridge too far, if you will. And the Russians thought they got a great deal. They really thought they tricked Seward, who was the Secretary of State at the time, into way overpaying for Alaska. Because in the Americans, they thought it was stupid and silly too, because they called it Seward's Folly. But then we know Alaska was well worth the money. Well worth the money. Let's look how Japan's doing here. Okay, they're doing all right. They landed down here in the south, taking the island. That's smart. They've got a good sort of border. Yeah, Japan's doing all right against China. So yes, this game has gone off the rails officially now that the U.S. is at war with France and Britain. Again, as most of you know, I am a culturalist. I try to judge large groups of people. Individuals are individuals, but large groups of people by their culture, not by their genetics. So, yeah, I'm sure there are people with Russian genes that are direct lineage to the early colonies people, as opposed to more modern Russians have come in. Obviously, that's happened too. But I don't think culturally there's any Russian culture here, where you can go to some of this region here. I'm forgetting exactly where. There's actually a fairly large Swedish group that, in Minnesota, I think it is mostly in Minnesota, which is up here. A large sort of Swedish cultural group that is still sort of Swedish. It's sort of Swedish American or whatever, that migrated in, well after American independence in the 19th century. And so some of these groups have maintained a cultural lineage to their past, but I don't really think that's the case with anybody remaining from Russia. Ah, my last name is Olesen. Right, is Swedish. Absolutely, Brett. Okay. Yes, so you obviously know that there's a lot of cultural elements. Some of it is maybe superficial stuff like food, but other stuff that is still very much real in that part of the world. Okay, we're going to go for the second Vienna Award, just because that's what they did historically. And we already have Romania as an ally. Yeah, and I look at that as all happened because, not because of genetics, but somehow they're genetically more adapted. Well, actually, lighter skin is more genetically adapted to less sunlight, and that is a real thing. Darker skin is adapted to dealing with more sunlight, and lighter skin is adapted to dealing with less sunlight. So there's that genetic element of it, but I think it was more culturally. They were from an area that was more used to having god awful cold temperatures for part of the year, so they came here. Where my ancestors mostly moved sort of across the center of America over to California, and we like it nice and warm. Now we do have 17 divisions that we haven't used, but they're there to crush when we go north to Denmark, because we had problems with that. This was going to be useless. They found gold. Yes, they definitely found gold earlier on. What is Norway and Sweden? Yes, climate is similar, though there's not the mountains or the ocean. Asians in Minnesota. Well, recently I think there's a lot of Somalis moving in there, but that's another story. More recently, one of the people you mentioned, the gold rush up in Alaska, was Wyatt Earp. He heads up to Alaska for the gold rush up there and owns a saloon for a while. I don't know if he owned any mines or anything, but he was definitely making the money off of the miners in a saloon up there. So there was definitely thing. A friend of mine owned a Colt single action army. I think it was a single action army that had been Wyatt Earp's gun, and he had bought it off an Earp descendant and had it papered, and by that it means you send in the serial number and information to Colt, and they tell you about the gun, and it came back that gun was a special order by somebody, by Wyatt Earp, basically, at the address of the saloon that he owned, and he actually ordered the barrel length and sort of, custom gun of Wyatt Earp's from the days of his Alaska period, not from the Tombstone period. There's probably 10 or 20 confirmed guns that have good provenance to have been owned by Wyatt Earp. And of course, the valuable ones are from the Tombstone, or the super valuable ones are from the Tombstone days. All of them are valuable, of course. But if you have a gun that's not just, oh, somebody said it was Wyatt Earp's, but, documentation. Okay, United Kingdom called Bhutan again, and the British Salvadorian, into the British Salvadorian War. So now Bhutan is now also an enemy of America as well. Yeah. Well, I do need to move. I'm going to try to not do battle plans. It may be necessary, and I know I'm sort of not taking every advantage by it, but I want to manually do it, and I'm not going to try to take the bonus of the battle plans. Yeah, no, she is. And let me say something on that subject about Trump comments about quote unquote the squad, and particularly that one congresswoman. he said, well, go make the countries, and he's also saying that Rashida Tlaib, one of the other congresswomen, is Palestinian origin, and the other is, although she was born and raised in New York City area at least, is Puerto Rican in culture and descent. And Puerto Rico, we're seeing the demonstrations literally, if not today, they've been happening, and they probably are happening this weekend, but they are probably literally happening as I'm speaking here, trying to call for the corrupt governor to step down in Puerto Rico. That they're talking about going back, and also Somalia, going back and fixing your countries and figuring that out. And then he actually, in the original text, tweet that he says, and then once you get that done, then come back to America and tell us how you did it then. So he wasn't saying go away and don't be American. He's saying, well, you're coming from these other places culturally, one of them actually born, but culturally from these other places. And you're coming into America, again, a Palestinian, a Puerto Rican, who, yes, is an American citizen, but not from the United States, as in the 50 United States, but yes, an American citizen. And I think the Somalia woman committed perjury on her citizenship application. We can talk, she definitely committed perjury on some other sworn documents. But if you commit perjury on your citizen application, that is reason to revoke your citizen application. So, yeah. Oh, it is. It is. And it's partially Italy's fault. Because we can look at Somaliland that's trying to be independent, that has these borders of Britain, and they're doing great. In comparison, Somaliland, there's no terrorist attack. It's safe for a European to walk around their cities. They wouldn't harm them, other than the usual possible minimal robbery situation, but that would only to steal something, not to harm them as a person. Just, the thievery that goes on in the world. But yeah, it's safe to walk around Somaliland today. But Somalia, which almost nobody recognizes Somaliland, but Somalia, the former Italian colony territories, is really bad. And there's multiple reasons for it. It's also, I say, partially Italy, because we can see the slight difference in Somaliland, but it's also partially the Arab control of the coast. It's also part of the local cultural problems. But I think she committed perjury on some of her statements to become a U.S. citizen, documentation to become a U.S. citizen, and that would be reason to reject her as a citizen. Excuse me, hiccups. But he's talking about these women who 3 of the 4, so the majority of these women, come from culturally different environments. Puerto Rico has a different culture. It is a Spanish cultural heritage that is different than the Spanish cultural heritage coming out of Texas. Texicans from, the Mexican Texan people are different peoples than the Puerto Rican peoples. Yes, they both come from a Hispanic culture, but they're different cultural groups of people. Again, I'm talking cultural groups here. And so this is a mess. It is corrupt. Yes, Chicago's corrupt. Yes, Louisiana's corrupt. Oh, Louisiana's French cultural. Chicago, part of its culture is corrupt, is its rush of 19th century immigrant groups. And we can talk about why, but we can also talk about this region of Italy here is partially why the corruption still remains in Chicago, and then it also affects, because it's the largest voting bloc, all the rest of Illinois, and its corruption. So, again, I'm talking culture here, nothing to do with skin color or eye color or gender. I'm talking pure culture here. And so Trump was saying, okay, you come from places that are messed up by our standards. Go back, fix those places. Once they're fixed up as good or better than here, then come and tell us how we should be running ourselves. Now, they have every right, at least the 3 of them that I think were born with U.S. citizenship. They have every right to run for Congress. They have every right to be Congress people. But that doesn't mean anybody should listen to them. And so we can criticize them for their policies and their statements. I think all three of them are I think three of them are anti-Semites. Probably all four of them are anti-Semites. And there's various reasons for that. It is not. What does perjury mean? Perjury is lying under oath on an official document, or it's like lying in a court trial when you swear to tell the truth. If you're found to be lying, that is a criminal. That is a felony. To perjure yourself. Pledge of Allegiance, because it's not inclusive of all Americans. Like, yeah, it is. Yeah, I thought the Pledge of Allegiance was specifically to include all Americans. And so, yeah, there's going to be a reckoning coming, and this is. Well, I think we're going to end this episode here. We've gone on long enough. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Thanks for liking the videos. Really do appreciate it. I know this wasn't very... Well, no. I know it wasn't a very long episode, but we're getting off topic, so I think we're going to end it here. So thanks very much for watching. Sorry for the off topic. I know we're still moving here. So see you next time for more Hearts of Iron.